today for our webinar from our employee experience series. In this series, we touch topics which are related to employee experience and the journey at an organization which you can leverage to drive business performance. I'm Hemendra from Great Place to Work, and in today's webinar, we will discuss a very important topic which has become even more relevant during such unprecedented times. Our topic for today is 3 priorities for creating a culture of learning in an organization. You're all welcome to ask any questions in our chat box, and we will try to address them, as I said, during or after the webinar. So let me welcome Petra, who is the CEO of Petra and Associates Consulting and an accredited professional with Great Place to Work. She is a senior learning and development consultant with over 30 years of experience in corporate world and private practices. So without further ado, I would pass the mic to Petra, as we have very little time, as she has already shared, and this is a vast topic for us to discuss. So passing over to you, Petra.
Thank you so much, Hemendra, and welcome everybody to today's little short webinar here on such an important topic, and a topic that is really dear to my heart, and building out a learning culture. And you might wonder, why am I speaking about this topic? Some of you know me, some of you don't, and you might think like, so who is she to talk about this? So, you know, that's the big question mark. And the first thing I want to say to that is, nothing is as thrilling as learning new things. So that's kind of a motto in my life. It's been a personal path. I call myself a lifelong learner. I've been very lucky to have a good formal education, but also to have had lots of opportunities for learning and development programs through organizations I've been a member of. And also, since I started my private practice in 2011, I've really gone on such a learning journey. It's been a very interesting ride. And with that, I'm combining all those things in how I'm working with my clients. So this, of course, is a very large topic. 3 priorities to creating a culture of learning. And we specifically want to look at it through this lens that COVID-19 has thrown us all into. None of us have asked for this. So suddenly we have this COVID-19 situation, and everything has changed, and learning and development is just one of those things. So I want to look at it specifically through that lens. What do we do during this pandemic, and what will we do with regards to learning culture once we get out of the pandemic, which is hopefully sooner rather than later? Because it's such a big topic, I had to kind of cut it down onto something a bit more bite-sized. The first one I want to talk about is the integration through onboarding, because onboarding new team members is so important. And it's not only new team members, we may be talking about that a little bit as well. It's also if your team members switch jobs, go to a new department, take on new responsibilities. They need to be onboarded for that new role as well. Then we want to talk a little about budget prioritization. Budget is, of course, on the forefront of many of HR leaders, learning and development leaders, and executives. And we need to think about how we spend our money. What's the best way to spend the money? So we'll talk a little about that, because I know that many learning and development leaders and HR leaders have a budget issue. And then we want to talk about something that you might think is an oxymoron: planning for flexibility. So we've got 3 juicy topics here. As Hemendra said before, type into the chat or the questions if you have any questions. We'll try to get to all the questions on the webinar. If not, then he will pass them on to me, and I will send you a personal email with the response to your question afterwards. So let's get started, okay? Onboarding. Onboarding is a big topic by itself, and so I'm cutting it again into 3 pieces. The first piece of onboarding, what we do during onboarding, is we're welcoming the new team member to the organization. Very important that they feel immediately they're part of the team. They're part of the new team that you're bringing in, and they need to feel welcomed. They need to feel like they've made the right choice. Taking on a new role is always a scary thing, because you're giving up something and you're taking on something new, and it could be the wrong choice. So they want to be reassured that this was the right choice. So that's really important when we're onboarding somebody. Now, here's a poll I picked up at an HR meeting I attended not too long ago. And it said that when onboarding new employees, is your process more virtual than it was before COVID-19? To not much of a surprise, 75% said yes. So when we're looking at onboarding, now team members are remote, And you know the saying, out of sight, out of mind. There's a real danger that because you don't have that team member in front of you, you don't pass by their desk, that you're not actually thinking about connecting with them. There's a real risk of not building that personal connection in a remote environment. Many of your teams are probably still remote or at least partially remote. So in this case, we really need to think about how do we onboard somebody? How do we welcome them to the organization? Normally, pre-COVID, you probably would have thought about developing an onboarding plan. So if I think back to some of my roles, I was always impressed with an organization when I came in, and the first day on the job, I would have a schedule where my first 1 or 2 weeks looked like, and who I would be meeting, and where I would have my meetings, and what I would be learning during those 2 weeks. There wasn't really an expectation that I go right to production. The expectation was that I'm learning how to navigate this organization. Who will I work with? Who will I collaborate with? And that type of onboarding was very important to me. So now we're remote. Everybody is sitting in their own home office on the corner of their bed to do their jobs. And it's so much harder to do this type of onboarding, but it's not impossible. So what you can do is still look at cross-functional onboarding, welcoming, building out personal connection, and staying in touch with that new team member. If you're an HR professional, that might mean that your role is to facilitate that and to help the teams to actually deliver this onboarding. So virtual meetings are really important in this place, because that's how you can build that personal connection in the best possible way with remote teams. So you want to maybe take a role of facilitating and scheduling those kind of meetings, speaking to the team members and encouraging them to set up those calls or setting it up for them. Now, the next part of onboarding is onboarding a new employee to corporate introduction. So a new team member comes on board, they need to know what this organization is all about. They need to know about purpose, values, goals, about how they fit in the role in this bigger picture, and how do they contribute to the goals of the organization. What are the typical structures, the procedures and processes that they need to follow? What's the how do we do things around here? So this is something that should be more centralized. It's typically more common for everybody who's joining the organization. And so this is something where really HR is being asked to contribute to this. And depending on the size of your organization, this may be an area where you start thinking about automating. Certain things could be packaged in a video training that you put on a learning path of those new team members. And then there is the in-person follow-up to ensure that they understand how they fit into the picture. If you're onboarding a number of people at the same time, then you can actually do this in groups. You can give them their learning, and then in a group meeting, you can have interactive discussions about how they will be contributing to the organization as a whole. It helps them to meet others, to build already connections, which is so important, particularly when your team is remote. So we want to start thinking about, okay, here's a new team member coming on. How can we do this effectively and efficiently? And then there's the task-specific training. Of course, that's the bulk of the training. People need to know what their job is going to be. They need to know how to do that, how to collaborate with their team members, how to deliver their output, that sort of thing. So a common way to teach this is in the 70-20-10 model. The 70-20-10 model means that 70% of what they need to learn is learning on the job. 20% is through coaching and mentoring, and only 10% is actually through formal learning programs. So now in the COVID environment, in the pandemic environment where people are remote or partially remote, we need to start thinking through this and say, how can we actually deliver that? So maybe you set up a buddy system. You put that new team member in touch with another colleague, maybe a senior manager, maybe their supervisor, and you build out a buddy system where they learn on the job from that other person. It may be multiple people to share that job. So how do you set that up? How do you provide that support to the buddy who may have never trained anybody? So that's kind of your role in HR and in learning and development to support that. What's the mentoring structure you want to put in place? Do you have internal or external coaches you can draw on? What's the support you might want to give to their line manager to become a better coach and mentor? And how can you facilitate that? Maybe you provide them with some coaching templates. Maybe you give them a recommended schedule of how many calls they do and how they report back, how they track the progress, those kind of things. And then what courses should this new team member actually have? Now, if you have a learning platform and maybe you've tapped into a content provider, that by itself can be totally overwhelming for a new team member. Now they're looking at something that has hundreds of courses. So you might want to consider building out a specific learning journey and signing up that new team member to that learning journey and give them a schedule to accomplish that. And your automated introduction to the organization could be part of that. So that's kind of an overview of onboarding and onboarding in this environment where your teams might be remote or partially remote. Hemendra, do you have any questions, or are there any questions that came in through the chat box?
It does. Like this onboarding piece is a huge piece, and you've just rightly touched the aspects which are like a few of the most important aspects. And I believe concrete learning processes and practices that you just talked about, they definitely help in creating a supportive learning environment. So I see you highlight onboarding as an important opportunity for providing training in an organization. What about the existing staff?
And that's a really good point, because when you're moving team members to new roles, or when the role changes, there is some onboarding work that needs to be done at that point as well. So the new team member, or the team member that comes to a new department, they might know a lot about the company. They might know about that previous job. And then there is a certain expectation that they know more than they actually do know. Very often team members who are moving from one position to another, they don't go through an onboarding in this new job. There's just an expectation they'll know how to do it. And so that we need to just tap into that and really understand, to what extent do they understand their new role, their new fit? What is their learning journey that they need to go through so that they can now be as good in this new job as they were in the previous job, or better? So I think it's really important for us to think of onboarding, not only for new team members, but also for those who transition, or when the situation changes totally. COVID meant that lots of jobs totally changed. Well, we need to provide that support and that training to those team members.
That's really interesting. I also have one more question. So these learning programs that you just spoke about, how do these help to support a learning culture in an organization?
Yeah, so I think I want to go back to that story that I told when I came into an organization and I found a whole schedule. Well, that makes a certain impression on me as a new team member. I immediately know that this organization they care about their people. They want to make sure that you get all the tools to be successful, that you are comfortable in your new role. And so I think this first impression to an organization is hugely important. And quite honestly, I think if you don't do onboarding right, then it's very difficult to creating a culture of learning, because people feel like, okay, I'm just thrown in here and basically I have to wade through the mud and kind of figure it out myself. That's not learning culture. That's like, okay, so we're just leaving them to their own devices. Learning culture means that we are providing that support, and people know that it's expected of them to consistently work on their own processes and to improve. And that's where the learning culture comes from.
Interesting. That really resonates well with me, and I would want you to maybe proceed, as we are sensitive to time and we are already halfway through the presentation.
Yeah, and I noticed that there was a question from Joanne, and I can hardly see everything here. This panel is a little small, about best practices for mentoring, to foster mentoring. And I think the important part is that if you want your leaders to mentor, you need to mentor your leaders. So I think you need to provide them with some tools. Not every supervisor and line manager has ever learned how to coach. They haven't learned how to mentor their team members. So it's about figuring out where they are on that learning journey and providing them with the appropriate support to do that. And partially it's just providing them with some cheat sheets, like questions that they can ask their team members, which are appropriate within your organization and can help flush out what's going on for the team members. Particularly right now, we want to tap into that and be interested in their well-being. But you're absolutely right, Hemendra. I need to go on, or otherwise we can't get through all of this. So we want to talk about the next piece, which is about budget prioritization. So what I hear often is when COVID hit, budgets were cut. Suddenly, you know, they might have had a budget for the full year, which would have been providing them with ample amount of money to provide training to their leaders and their teams, and suddenly all of this is gone. But at the same time, they were asked to support these new initiatives. So let's say, oh, our team goes remote, they have new computers, they need some help in understanding how to use the computer and the software from their home office. You need to support that, but no, you've got no money for it. And I suspect some of you who are on the line may have heard something very different. So when crisis strikes, we have a tendency and we want to use a fire hose to do it. So we want to douse that fire that is burning so hot, and that doesn't really work. Because here's the thing, COVID-19 is a typical example of what we call a VUCA environment. And I want to go through what that actually means. So VUCA the V stands for volatility. So volatility, constant changes. In this environment, everything has been constantly changing. The government was changing their directives. The supply chain has changed. We have new policies, new procedures. Everything is happening very fast and without notice, and it keeps changing. So it's not only it changed once and then now you think, okay, that's what it is. No, the next day it could be different. So that's a very volatile environment. Uncertainty. We don't really know how long this is going to last, and we don't really yet know exactly what the long-term impact is going to be on the economy, on organizations like ours, or organizations we typically deal with. Disruption is everywhere. So it's not only one organization that is disrupted, it's everybody is disrupted. So if we're thinking about the whole economy being like a network of things, every disruption, it's a bit like a spider web. When you touch it on one side, the whole spider web starts wobbling. Well, this is what's happening here. Everything's wobbling right now. And then there is an ambiguity. So everybody experiences this in a different way. For me, for example, I absolutely love working from home. For somebody else, it's a personal crisis. They've got kids, they've got a partner, they have limited bandwidth, and everybody wants to be on this computer at the same time. So this is something that we don't really know what is going on in this environment. So how can we, in this type of environment, create a learning culture? And I call it learning culture VUCA style. So how do we deal with volatility? One way how you could deal with that is to really think about social learning and micro learning. So when you're bringing in a new team member, as we talked about before, that team member needs to be connected with other team members in their environment, in their organization. So that's the social learning. They can learn from each other. So tap into your teams. There's a lot of wisdom there. And I think when you actually bring that wisdom up to the front, it's actually motivating for people to help share and bring somebody else on board. Micro learning, often they don't have a lot of time. So we want to give them small learning components that they can do in between. How do we deal with the uncertainty? Uncertainty to constant changes. Well, I think we need to bring some mindfulness to this, some deep listening, really talk to our people, have conversations with them. And that's the hard part when you have out of sight, out of mind. So you have to almost create a process for you to reach out and connect with people. Complexity, how do we deal with that? Well, there's lots of tools. So when we think about virtual meetings, you might have a tool, you can use Zoom, which is inexpensive. You can use Teams, you can use Skype for Business, even Google Hangouts. There's all these different tools, how you can have your team members and leaders and team members connect. So there's lots of tools for that. You can use Teams for chatting, Slack if you use that. So there's lots of opportunities for us to tap into these tools. 20 years ago, we would have not been in this place where we can still connect and do business in a pandemic. So we actually have an ideal environment for us to continue to do business and to have connections with our team members. And then with the ambiguity, I think it's really understanding where people are. And that you can only do by communicating with them, by having conversations. And these conversations can be, again, in a virtual meeting, but you might also just pick up the phone to do a change. You know, not everybody has to always be on camera. So when, before we go into planning for flexibility, maybe there is some questions to this part of the topic on budget. We obviously need to manage that in a process of not throwing everything at the fire, but also keeping some for later.
Yes, Petra, I completely agree. These are some really interesting points, and I truly believe the learning culture part that you're talking about, every organization rather should be a learning organization, because these are the organizations which can adapt more quickly during these unpredictable times and than the competitors ever could. So this is very interesting, and the VUCA is a very interesting concept indeed. And let me put you in spot because of the environment we are in, the VUCA that is more prevalent right now. So when do you think all this is going to get over?
Well, I wish I had that magic ball that I could say, okay, that day is when we all are vaccinated. I don't have that, but to be quite honest, I think that we are now in an environment that is kind of always changing, and we need to be very, we have to get accustomed to that. And this is almost like a process that we're learning. A lot of people didn't think that, you know, everybody could be remote, and suddenly they could. So maybe it's teaching us to not say no, but say, okay, let's think about that. How could we make this way happen? And we become more agile. I do think that also this has been going on for a long time now, and so long that some of the workforce will quite like what the new situation is, and they won't want to give it up. So we want to be able to be flexible at the same time as still as getting out of panic mode, really. So it's combining those two. So I think it will continue for a while.
Yes, I also want to know, so if we are remaining in an ongoing volatile business environment, how do you think organizations can create a more lasting learning culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is a great segue to my next piece. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question. So when we are thinking about that, we need to start thinking about planning for flexibility. So as I said, that's a bit of an oxymoron, because when we do plan, we typically want to create something that is supposed to happen like we plan it in the future. But when we think about flexibility, we want to be able to kind of dance in the moment, be agile, and adjust to what the situation is. So why do I think this is so important? If you think back when we started learning and development a little while ago, everybody was going for the creation of e-learning programs. So truly automated programs that are asynchronous and that are to a certain extent interactive. Now, doing this actually is quite slow to do and therefore expensive to do. Did you know that to create 1 hour of interactive e-learning content takes about 197 hours to create that 1 hour of content? So when you think about that, in a volatile environment where everything's constantly changing, you can't really create something and tomorrow everything is different and you have to change it, and it's costly to do that. So that's on one side of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is in-person training. Of course, many probably have done lots of in-person training, and many organizations were reliant on in-person training. But so while that's less time to develop and it's also a bit more flexible to adjust, it does limit scalability. If you have large organizations that are geographically dispersed, there's a lot of cost to get together and do that. And right now, it may be too close for comfort. So that's not an ideal scenario either. Personally, I believe in the blended approach. So when I think blended approach, then I think that those trainings can be engaging, they can be scalable, agile, they're fun, team-oriented. We can put a lot of things into it. And like any bartender knows, and you might have been wondering about this glass on the side, is you can mix the cocktail just to the liking of the client. So how you are incorporating these different ingredients in the learning can be totally customized and depends on your organization, the learners, the learning objectives, and so forth. So really building out training that is customized to the situation and the organization is what I think is the best way to develop training in this type of environment. It may include some e-learning components. It may include a live interaction. It may include some coachings and some exercises, some reflection. All of those things can be part of that sort of training. So when we're thinking about developing learning interventions for a learning culture, we need to kind of balance the firefighting with the strategic direction. So what does that mean? When we're thinking about short term, there is leader request. Somebody comes to you and says, we need this training for this new software, for this new process, for this new product. Well, then you are in reactive mode. This is a short-term thing. They want it usually yesterday. There's hardly ever budget for it, but they want you to get onto it. So that's when you are reactive. And this is not going to go away. You can only manage that to a certain extent. You also may want to become a bit proactive in the short-term areas. And you can do that by generating, let's say, meeting polls in a team meeting, surveys, pulse surveys, like the Great Place to Work pulse surveys are great for doing that. Understanding what is going on right now for your team members. And then you can be proactive and proposing something. And then, of course, long-term, you want to be strategic in your planning. And that's really where you need good data to base that plan on. Now, of course, the Great Place to Work Trust Index is perfect because it gives you a lot of rich data that you can dig into, and you understand from there what HR programs you want to develop, what learning and development you want to develop. So understanding the data first and then developing the strategic approach to that. That's really the balancing act that a learning and development manager has to take between these short-term interactions and then the long-term ones. So I want to just wrap up because I know I'm very close to time. There's 3 takeaways for you from today. First one is onboarding is important and use a versatile team-based approach. You can include your team members in this, use some social learning, use some short micro-learning stuff to help them to really settle into the organization and into the new role. Then there's room for low budget, agile training, and then long-term strategic learning interventions. And you need to balance those out in your organization. It's important to get the right data for it. So get the data, prioritize, and then do one thing at a time. You can get very overwhelmed when you're working on so many projects. So ultimately, it's important to prioritize the projects and then deliver them one at a time. I've spoken a lot about planning and about these different VUCA environments. So I've created a little document that you'd be welcome to download. Just go to bit.ly/3xlearning. And that's where you can get the document, and it will help give you some support in the planning processes that you do in order to incorporate what we were talking about here today. And then, of course, I'd invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn, or send me an email, whatever it is, if I can support you. I'd love to hear from you. Also, feedback on the webinar here today for anybody who is watching live or the recording. And don't forget to get your document at 3x Learning.
Sure. So before we end, Petra, may I ask one more question? I really find the third part very interesting, and this approach that you have regarding the right balance of planning and flexibility. I think this is the core to your business. Would you share, how do you help your clients through this process? Like just quickly before we conclude.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Hemendra. So yeah, I've done a lot of different things in my life, in my career. And so I think I have this balance of being a project manager who likes planning and a person who likes to go with the flow and really adapt to what the situation is like. So I'm combining those 2 things in my work with my clients. I take my clients through action planning, where we really define what the learning intervention needs to be and then help them to start creating them and continuously looking for opportunities for improvement. So I use that blended approach to create automated learning as well as incorporate where the learning needs to be more flexible and then incorporate the live interactions for those. So help my clients with strategizing those things and then implementing it, helping them to project plan it and put the right systems in place so that they can deliver that.
That is interesting. Thank you so much, Petra, for your time today and for emphasizing on the fact that learning culture is one of the biggest drivers of business impact, and that is what actually separates great workplaces from the rest. So thank you for your time. Anything that you'd like to conclude with? I'm sure or the audience can see the contact. They can reach Petra on LinkedIn for helping you to create a learning culture. Petra, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Hemendra, and to Great Place to Work for hosting today's webinar. And thank you for those of you who showed up here in live, or for those of you who are watching the recording. Pleasure to be here, and I hope all goes well. Stay safe and stay sane in this crazy environment that we're working in right now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.